I'm so grateful that we can be together on this very special Sunday. And I'm reminded as we heard this reading about the commandments of God, that for those of us who profess faith in Jesus Christ, the great commandment is always this: to love God with all of our hearts and to love our neighbor as ourselves. To love our neighbor means that as Christians we have a moral responsibility, and that responsibility is to understand our neighbor. And when we understand our neighbor, the presence of God is there, and the world becomes a better place. But interestingly enough, when we begin to understand our neighbor, it opens a door inside our hearts to understand ourselves better. And so today we have our third conversation of faith. It's an opportunity to understand our neighbor. And so in addition to being one of the great drummers today, Reverend Tom Karai is also a Buddhist priest. And I would like for you to welcome him as my guest to First Congregational Church. Yes, microphones are very important. It's so good to see you. Welcome. Are you good? Yes, you are now fully turned on.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay.
And that's what we like in our church. It is so good to see you and welcome you today. Thank you for being here with us.
You're
you
welcome.
cannot live in Southern California and not recognize the influence of the East in our culture, and particularly Buddhism in our culture. But I think I would like to begin today by asking you this question. What does the word taiko mean?
Literally it means large drum, but it refers to the art form of Japanese folk drumming.
Very fine. And so it's really an art of the people, isn't it?
Yes, it is. How many of you have seen taiko outside of the church before? Several people, yes. It's becoming more and more popular in many countries. There's probably a taiko group in every state now in the United States. There's about, I would say in Southern California alone, including collegiate groups, I would say about 40 groups.
Very fine. Well, it's an honor to have you here. They sound great outside. They sound spectacular inside.
It wasn't too loud, was it? No.
It was terrific. Thank you. So, Reverend Karai, I wish you would just share for a few moments today something of your own spiritual journey, because I think people are always interested to know how you got to this place today.
Yes. I was born in Japan, and I grew up in a Buddhist temple, specifically Soto Zen. As in Christianity, there's different denominations of Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism. And so growing up there, my grandfather, as a matter of fact, we go back 7 generations. And so my mother, however, was born in Cupertino. Anybody know where that is? And it's near San Jose. And when she was 12 years old, she was sent to Japan. And later on, she met my father. And it was an arranged marriage, which was common in those days. And when I was 5 years old, we came to Los Angeles. And my father was a missionary in Little Tokyo downtown. There's several Buddhist temples in Little Tokyo, because that was the beginning of the Japanese community there. And he actually came here for my mother, because during the war, my mother lost her American citizenship because she was a teacher. And so she had no way to come back, and so my father decided to become a missionary, and he sent for us when I was 5 years old, and I came here with my sister and myself. and my mom, and she was reunited with her family here in Los Angeles. And we were intending to go back after 10 years, but we just stayed.
You stayed.
And so I grew up going to Sunday school. We have Sunday school also in Little Tokyo at a temple called Zen Shuji Soto Mission. And I had never really discussed becoming a priest before with my father until I decided to go back to Japan and study Japanese. And after studying for 2 years, my third year there, I entered a monastery. And at that time, I was 29 years old. And so when I came back, I helped my father for 3 years, and fortunately, he died at age 69. And the board members asked me to take over our temple, which my father had started in 1971 after spending 17 years at the Soto Mission in Little Tokyo. And so now I've been there longer than my father has. It's my 28th year as the minister there. But I've always had other jobs. I've been doing taiko for 40 years, and I've been a minister for 29 years. So that's how it all began.
Very fine. So one of the things that I know that in the Christian tradition, we put a great deal of emphasis upon church and the congregation. And in addition to worship services, we like potluck dinners and coffee fellowship time and having fun time together and building community. What is community like in the Buddhist tradition? And what do you do at the Buddhist temple?
Yes. The Buddhist religion usually takes on the structure of the culture or the country that it goes to. And so I could only speak to the Japanese American community. The first immigrants from Japan, called Issei, first generation, needed a place to socialize, a place to worship, and to practice their culture and language. So that's how the Buddhist missions and temples started. And today it's very different. It's very multicultural, especially in Zen Buddhism. I don't know if some of you remember back in the 60s, the Beat Generation with Allen Ginsberg and poets like that, Tom Snyder. They started practicing Zen Buddhism, specifically the meditation. And so now we not only have congregational temples like the Christian churches, and by the way, in Japan, they don't necessarily have services on Sundays. They have them still based on the lunar calendar on the day the occasion falls on. But in the United States, starting in Hawaii, because that's where the first immigrants came, the temple services, the Buddhist services are held on Sundays, just like the Christian churches. And we have Sunday school, and we even had Christmas celebrations at the temple, and Santa Claus will come out and give us presents. We celebrated Easter as well, with the Easter egg hunt. So it was taken out of the religious context, but we're Americans, so we're practicing customs that Americans practiced. The activities that we have that unite the congregation are based on our observances, our Buddhist observances, starting with New Year, Setsubun, which comes from the Shinto religion. In Japan, it's very harmonious. All of the religions that are there, the Shintoism, which is the indigenous religion of Japan, the belief in different gods. Buddhism, which originally comes from India through China to Korea. And then the Christian families will do a Christian wedding and be baptized in a Shinto shrine, and then when they die, have a Buddhist funeral.
That's called covering the bases.
Yeah, that's right. Japanese people in general are very open about other religions. And so the ceremony called Setsubun, which I'm missing, by the way, is today at my temples I had to call a replacement. It's celebrating the turning of the winter to the spring season. And then we have the spring and fall equinox, where we have harmony all day. The number of hours during the day and night are even. And then our biggest celebration or service is Obon, which is practiced in July and August. It's the honoring our ancestors. And we do that by celebrating in a folk dance. And that's where the taiko comes in to keep the time and the beat for the folk dances. And we also have the Buddha's death, which is in February, the Buddha's birth in April, and his enlightenment, which is in December. So all of these we celebrate, just like coming to a Christian church.
You celebrate as a community.
Yes.
Yes.
And then we always have refreshments later.
So you like potluck dinners too?
Oh, yes.
Yes, okay,
Same
good,
thing.
good.
And one thing new we added about 3 years ago is having fundraisers going to the Pala Casino.
A casino fundraiser. Think about that, Shanna.
Yes. It's because they provide the bus absolutely free. And we just have to provide 50 people. And, we charge $25 per person on the bus. And then we have bingo on the bus, going there and coming back.
The deacons are getting very nervous back there.
Yes.
I can feel it.
So it's a very win-win situation. And so it's a good thing that our precepts don't say anything about not gambling.
Well, one thing that I think is really helpful with that explanation is that so many people, I think, associate the Buddhist religion with a very individualized, personal, spiritual thing, which I think that's part of it, even it's part of the Christian faith.
Yes.
But there's also an emphasis on community as well.
Yes.
And I think that's important to recognize.
Yes, it is. Many people have that misconception of practicing Buddhism as something for the individual. And for example, in Zen Buddhism, when we meditate, it helps us to center ourselves and become more aware of ourselves. It's the self being the self at that moment. It helps us live moment to moment, because the most important thing when we're living our day to day, is that moment. And once that moment is gone, you can't get it back. So it's to live wholeheartedly moment to moment. And when we realize that, we become enlightened moment to moment as well. Some people have the misconception that enlightenment is something you have to earn or something that you have to wait until you grow older. But it happens anytime and any place. And it doesn't happen to the individual alone. When the individual is enlightened, you see the light. Every sentient being, human, animal, plants, are enlightened at the same time. This is the concept of enlightenment.
It's really
it's
interesting.
Universal, and it recognizes the interconnectedness of all people in this universe.
That's really interesting. It sort of reminds me of something I've made this distinction through the years, that religion is deeply personal, but it's really not individualistic. Deeply personal, but it connects us with community.
Yes, that's true. Before I came, I was looking on my bookshelf, and I picked out a book called Zen and Christian by John Dykstra Usden. He was a congregational minister and a professor, and he remained a Christian, but he practiced Buddhism to become a better Christian. And he said in his books, I'm going to quote, some proponents of Christianity will often try to end attempts to reach beyond their own traditions by such expressions as a person who really knows this religion, whatever religion you belong to, knows all religions. But we're beginning to realize that it's more correct to say a person who knows only one religion does not really know any.
That's a very good quote. Thank you for that. So I want to back up just a second because I don't want to assume too much. We have a wonderfully intellectual, smart congregation, but I'm wondering if you could just say in a few words, who was the Buddha?
There's many misconceptions about that too. People talk about, oh, I love that laughing Buddha, and there's one, in the exhibit. As a matter of fact, Buddha means the enlightened one. Anyone has the potential to be an enlightened one, enlightened person. And this was one man who was human. He was a prince in a region, what is now called Nepal. And his father had a vision. A prophet told him that his son, his name was Siddhartha, given name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he was his father was the king of the Shaka clan, and the prophet told his father that your son is going to be a person who renounces the world and becomes a great prophet or teacher, or a great ruler. So his father did all he could to sequester his son in the confines of the palace so that he would not see the outside world. And so when he was 16, he got married, later had a child, and he had all the luxuries, anything you can want material-wise, but he always had this restless feeling that, there's something else. And so when he was 29, he snuck out of the confines and saw 4 things. One, a sick person. He'd never seen a sick person before. A second was an old man. And a third, a funeral procession. Saw a coffin. And the fourth was a man that didn't seem to have anything material-wise, looked very poor, but he seemed very content. And so he said he wanted to meet that man. And so after he realized what was out there in the world, he stayed there, and he left his family and began to teach for 45 years. And he gained enlightenment after 6 years learning from Hindu and other Brahmin teachers. But he found that the teachings were very selfish, that he didn't want to do something just to improve himself. And then there were other practices that were very austere. For example, starving and hanging themselves upside down. And so he meditated under a tree called the Bodhi tree for 7 weeks. And he went through 4 phases of awareness. And he finally came to the realization that he wanted to help and serve people by recognizing that there is suffering in this world and finding a cause for that suffering, and then ending the suffering by following what we call the Eightfold Path. And then later he had a following of hundreds of people, and he roamed the countryside, and he came up with the 4 truths, the 4 noble truths about suffering, that there's suffering, the cause for suffering, and ways to remedy that. And the 3 treasures, which are the Buddha, the teachings, and the Sangha. There's many teachings that have been turned into sutras that we chant. The chant earlier that I did was a westernized version of a Buddhist chant, because Buddhist chants are monotone, and so this has kind of like a melody to it. It's just reciting the Buddha's name. So in other words, the Buddha was a teacher who taught until he was 80 years old, and he died of some say food poisoning. And he found what we call the middle path, that you can't go two extremes. And so we try to practice that. And after he passed away, it moved to many countries. So in a nutshell, that's who the Buddha was.
I think you did better describing the Buddha in a short period of time than I could describe Jesus in a short period of time. Because it's not easy to encapsulate that. And yet, I don't know about you, but as I hear this, there are so many similarities to the Jesus story and the Buddha story. And I'm not saying they're exactly similar. I'm just saying there are similarities. Of Jesus, we think of Jesus as one, you read in the book of Philippians, that he counted equality with God, not something to hold on to, but emptied himself. That's the Christian version of Jesus leaving the palace. And then, where did he live? Not among the noble, but among the poor and the broken. And he lived among the people and saw the reality of daily living, and it changed him, and it shaped his teachings in a significant way. And he still calls his followers, which we consider ourselves followers, to somehow make a difference in the lives of others in this world. So the similarities are so remarkable to me. I find it very interesting.
The formal robes that we wear now are based on the Buddha's robes, which he made from rags and sewn together. This is not a formal robe, but if you take a close look at it, there are patches that are sewn together.
Well, in our tradition, we start out with the new robe, but it becomes rags by the time you retire. So that's how it works. So I'm wondering if you could just summarize, what are the most important ideas in Buddhism? What 2 or 3 ideas would you share with us?
Okay. First of all, that we are living this physical life, and it's temporary. And there is no concept of heaven, but there is a place that our being goes to after death. And where we go depends on how we live our lives. And there's no speculation about where we're going. It's just that we're gone. We become one with the universe. But the concept of reincarnation, which comes from Hinduism and the different canons and they call it about 540. There are 540 reincarnations of the Buddha before he became the Buddha, and this became what we call Jakarta tales, and they're tales of morality. And there's 10 important ones that point out different virtues that Buddhists should practice. So practice is more important than reading the Dharma, the teachings. What we do is important, but what we do comes from how we think. And so what we think and what we do should be positive and be good. And so another concept is interconnectedness of people, not only people, but with anything living, any living form. And also the interconnectedness of the past, present, and future. Because all of our memorial services, when we have one, when someone passes away, we not only pay honor and appreciation for that person, but for people who came before and people who are there at the service, and then future generations of children as well. I would say that Buddhism in general is a very welcoming religion where there is no prejudice in terms of what other people's religions are. And in particular, Zen Buddhism, we practice what we call zazen, which is sitting meditation, but we can practice zazen while we're doing other activities. For example, a simple thing like washing dishes or raking leaves or sweeping the floor. You just do that one thing and you become that one thing. So think before you act, right? You've heard of that. And so it helps us to focus and realize who we are and what we're doing at that moment so that we can always act in a good manner.
This is so helpful to me. And I keep thinking of all of these connections with the Christian faith. There's a passage in the New Testament where it talks about that whatever we are doing, we should do it to the glory of God. That, to me, is similar, a way of saying, be present with what you're doing.
Yes.
And be connected with what you're doing in that moment. And that becomes, as Shanna was saying with the children, a prayerful moment. So I like that, and I like that idea of interconnection because, again, one of my favorite passages from the New Testament is that it's the God that is above us, within us, and beyond us. And that's this whole interconnection of life. And to recognize that, you begin to see that every place and every moment is a place of the presence of the divine. And I think the Buddhist tradition helps shine a light on that. And one of the things that I think is so helpful is that the more we understand another person's tradition, it actually helps us begin to understand our own tradition better. And I think what you're saying is so helpful. I want to ask one more question because I got my signal that we're finished. But the question is this. We hear a lot about Zen Buddhism. And I know there are a lot of different kinds of Christianities. You got Methodists, Catholic, Congregationalists, Presbyterians. So there are a lot of different kinds of Buddhisms, right?
Yes.
Just very briefly, what is Zen Buddhism?
Well, the word Zen means meditation. It comes from China, which is Chan. And that's the central practice of Zen Buddhism. And again, not all Zen Buddhists practice meditation, but being in a meditative, mindful way, as much as you can, is also being meditative. So I call the taiko loud meditation. One more thing I forgot was very important about Buddhism is Buddha nature, that every person, regardless of their religion or faith, has a potential to become a Buddha, an enlightened person. Not the Buddha that's, hanging in the art gallery, but you, an enlightened person. And so everyone has this potential within themselves.
Thank you very much. And it has been so helpful to have you here today. And I just would like to say that outside, I am a Christian minister. In my heart and head, I'm a Christian minister. But also in my heart, I'm a Dharma bum.
Okay.
Thank you for being
All right.
with us today.
Thank you.